Hey crafty people! Welcome back to my channel, and in case you're new here, I'm Sarah, also known as Craft Nerd because I'm a nerd who loves to craft. I do paper crafting, card making, junk journaling, and mixed media art. Let's get crafting! Oh, welcome to my channel. In case you are new, what I am doing in the year 2026 is each month I'm picking a craft product to focus on. So like last month I focused on like patterned papers. And this month I'm going to be focusing on stamps. And I figured a good way to start out the month would be to have kind of a 101 video on stamps and ink selection for when you are stamping. In case you're new to stamping, or perhaps you've been stamping for a while but aren't quite getting the results you wanted, hopefully this video will help you out, letting you know. Okay, so I have no idea where I was. Let's start talking stamps and then we'll get into talking about inks. So there are two basic kinds of stamps, your red rubber stamps and your clear stamps. And the reason why I did air quotes around red rubber is because sometimes your red rubber is blue, like with these Stamping Bella stamps, or gray with the Stampenda stamps. But they're generally referred to as red rubber in the industry because I'm guessing that's pretty much how they started out, because most of the wood mounted ones I have are in fact red rubber. So that takes us to our next. Now with your rubber stamps, they come in three varieties, and I think I forgot something. Oh no, here it is. Okay. Your classic old school wood mounted, which you find less and less in craft stores these days. You probably have a better time finding them on like Etsy and eBay. I don't tend to see that as many. There's not as wide of a selection in like Michael's as there used to be. And so it's basically what it sounds like. It's a rubber stamp mounted on a solid wood block. And I suspect that's why you're not seeing these as often. It's because it's much more expensive to manufacture, because you've got to have this nice, and they're, you know, always nice wood blocks. They also take up a lot of space if you have a collection of wood mounted stamps. I watch Lindsay, the Frugal Crafter, and she just moved her craft studio in her house, and she has an entire wall of wood mounted stamps. It looks beautiful. They're very lovely if you have space to display them, but they take up a lot of space, and that is why I only have 3 right now, and it's pretty much because these are stamps that I never got around to taking off of their wood blocks. Many years ago, took all of my wood-mounted stamps off of the wood blocks and put them in CD or DVD cases for storage, because it takes up much less space that way. So that's option 1 for your red rubber. The next option is cling mounted, which is what you get when you buy like Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous rubber stamps. They're red rubber, they're cling mounted, and as long as you've got a newer manufactured more recently stamp set from Stampers Anonymous, yes, I can talk, it has the image printed on the back so that you can have some idea where you're stamping. Let me see, I have an older one. I have one older set. This is my one older set by Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous. So the old school ones came on white plastic instead of clear plastic, and the backs just had Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous on them. So that means you have no idea if you're stamping it right side up or not when you're looking at this side, and that looks to be upside down. So it goes, yeah, I think, yep, they put the stamp on this upside down. So even if you thought, oh, well, that's going to be right side up, no, that'd be upside down. And that's the one downside to even the red rubber where it's got the image printed on the back, and especially with the wood mounted, you can't tell as easily with them where you're stamping. And if you want something specifically stamped in a specific spot, it's pretty much a wing and a hope, because you can't actually see through the stamp as to where you are stamping, unlike with clear stamps, which you can. A little more on that in a sec. Because we've got wood mounted for your rubber stamps, cling mounted, and Stampendous, old school Stampendous stamps, their cling mounted were actually on little pieces of clear plastic with the image printed. And I trimmed off because it was usually like a whole wide excess that I did not need. And so there's a slight variation on the cling mounted, and then there's completely unmounted. Some stamp companies sell their unmounted stamps, and they usually sell for less money. I'm pretty sure because these are all Purple Onion design stamps, and these are all by Stacy Yakula is the designer, and I don't think she designs for them anymore, but as you can see, it's not mounted on anything. So you have a couple options. There's a product called Easy Mount that's sold, and it's basically this stuff. The gray material you see on the back of these guys. In fact, this is one was a wood mounted stamp. I unmounted it, and this is the Easy Mount Thin. The thin does not stick very well, as you can see from the fact that it's like flopping around. And then the regular Easy Mount, which is the thicker foam, clings a little bit better than the thin stuff. But it's basically sticky on this side, and so you stick your red rubber stamp down on it and then cut around it. But it's not necessarily as good as the stuff you get when you buy rubber stamp that is cling mounted. So that's pretty much why I haven't bothered with my Purple Onion stamps, because nowadays you can get, Purple Onion sells a 4x6 and a 6x6 version of their clear mounting stamp. Let me bring that out. Which is basically a piece of photopolymer like they make clear stamps out of. And you attach it to either a block or your MISTI if you have a MISTI. Actually, I think this one might be a little too big for all of the blocks I have. I don't know that I have a block big enough. But if you had a block big enough, because I have the 6x6, so if I had a 4x6, you stick it to your block, and then you take your unmounted red rubber stamp, and it sticks. And this works so much better than putting it on like Easy Mount. So once Purple Onion came out with this and I got one, I stopped mounting any of my unmounted stamps and just started using this. And usually I just use it in my MISTI. And if you're wondering what a MISTI is, it is, let me grab it. And I believe it stands for Most Incredible Stamping Tool Invented. And it basically is like a little hinge box that means you can guarantee that you are stamping in the same spot if you need to stamp something again because you didn't get a good impression the first time. Altenew also has their stamping wheel, which will also do this same basic function. There were a bunch of stamping platforms like this that came out within a year of the MISTI coming out, but My Sweet Petunias, the company that it came up with the MISTI, did enforce their patents pretty strenuously, which they have the right to do. So I know like Tim Holtz had a stamping platform that you might be able to get it secondhand, but you can't buy in stores here in the US anymore because of the MISTI patent issues. So, but they're out there. You might be able to find them secondhand. You don't absolutely need this. I caveat this by saying if you plan on coloring your images in using Copic markers, I highly recommend getting a MISTI. And I'll explain that in a second. So the second big basic type of stamps are clear stamps. Now, the advantage of clear stamps is you can see through the stamp where you are stamping. So it gives you an opportunity to do a better job of positioning your image because you need an acrylic block, But when you put it on, let me just find a piece of scrap paper. You'd think I'd have one around. I can see where I'm stamping. So if I wanted to stamp here, I can decide exactly where I'm going to stamp my image. That's the one big advantage of clear stamps. The one disadvantage is they don't take the ink quite as well as rubber stamp. Rubber stamps have a better stamping quality, and I'll do a demonstration of that in a minute. And that also depends a little bit on what ink you're using to stamp. Quick recap on our stamps. You've got your two basic varieties. You've got your rubber stamps, often referred to as red rubber, and they can come either wood mounted, cling mounted, or completely unmounted, which you basically just get the rubber stamp part of. The big advantage with your rubber stamps is they stamp better than clear stamps, generally speaking and overall. Then you have your clear stamps. The advantage of clear stamps is you can see exactly where you are stamping. They also tend to be a little less expensive than rubber stamps. And they take up less room, obviously, because I can fit in these type of DVD cases 2 layers. I can put stamps on both sides. If I was putting in red rubber stamps like this one, because they're thicker, I can only put the stamps on one side. I couldn't put stamps on the other. There wouldn't be enough room to close the case. So those are your main advantages with a clear rubber. Again, the big advantage is they stamp better. The disadvantage being you can't tell exactly where you're stamping, especially with a wood mounted and an unmounted one, because with the unmounted you don't have the image on the back. If you've got a cling mounted that has the image printed on the back, you can generally, like Stampers Anonymous, very high quality, very good job, pretty darn close to precise and exact as to where this lines up exactly with the actual stamp. Some other ones, not so much. So you may not be even looking at the image on the back, knowing precisely where you're stamping. Now, the next big thing that you need to know with regards to stamping is what ink you should choose. Oh, and a couple of just straight up accessories for stamping. Unless you've got a wood mounted stamp, you're going to need stamping blocks, which are usually clear acrylic blocks that you can stick your stamps to and stamp. I have a variety of them. I know with some of the Tim Holtz stamps that are larger, they come with a stamping block. I've got a whole bunch of them in a variety of sizes. So I've got this one that came with a Tim Holtz stamp, this one, and this one came with a Tim Holtz stamp. I've got this super thin one, which they're not as easy to grip, the super thin ones. I've got an old school one where it's kind of beveled on the edges. So I've got that. I've got these guys, those. So they come in a variety of shapes and sizes to suit your stamping needs. But if you are stamping with anything other than a wood-mounted stamp, you're gonna need at least one stamping block, right? If you're only getting one, get a bigger one, because you can always put your smaller stamps on. You can't put a bigger stamp on a smaller stamping block. It's not gonna work. But you don't need an insane amount of them, because, you know, pretty much as long as the stamp's gonna fit, you can work with whatever size stamping block. And then the other option is to get a MISTI, in which case you don't need a stamping block, you use the MISTI. I would also recommend a mouse pad, an old mouse pad, because your images are going to stamp better if you're stamping, if your paper is sitting on something that's got a little bit of squishiness to it, as opposed to like your hard mat. So if you're not using a MISTI and are just stamping, having a old mouse pad's great. And I have in my MISTI, in the bottom is a waffle flower cling mat. So The Misty comes with a piece of foam to sit inside, and when you're using like the mounted rubber stamps, you're supposed to take the foam out. But I replaced it with a waffle flower, and this is essentially the same stuff as the purple onion clear mounting stamp. So it's just like photopolymer, same stuff some of the your higher quality clear stamps are made of, and it's sticky on both sides. And so my papers stick to this, and it's got a little squishiness to it. So that's what I like using in my Misty these days. Now, you've got your stamps, you've got your paper, you've got your stamping blocks, and you want to start stamping. What ink do you use? And that answer depends on what you are stamping on and what techniques you're planning on doing with your stamped image. So your basic inks come in pigment, like VersaFine Clair and regular VersaFine, which is the old school version. I have yet to find anything online that can explain to me the distinction between VersaFine and VersaFine Clair, because they're both high quality pigment inks. And they're made by the same company. So I have no idea. I have not been able to figure out if there is in fact any difference, or if this is just like a rebranding, we're coming out with new colors kind of thing. But since I've been doing this for a very long time now, I have my old school VersaFine Clair, our VersaFine inks, and the only reason I have a black VersaFine Clair is because it came in a kit I bought from Simon Says Stamp. I would not have necessarily purchased a VersaFine Clair. And the VersaFine Clair black is called Nocturne. The VersaFine is Onyx Black, because I have an Onyx Black, and they are basically indistinguishable. As far, I can't tell a difference, and I'll show you in a second because I did stamp in advance a sampler. Next, you have your dye-based inks, which include inks like Memento, and Distress ink is a dye-based ink. And I also have recently picked up, because I was intrigued by the color, some Positively Saturated inks by Simon Says Stamp. I think they are a dye-based ink. Not 100% sure. Can't find any information telling me for sure. Then we've got our hybrid inks, like Distress Oxide. So it's possible it's a hybrid ink, which means it is a combination of a dye and a pigment ink. And then we have our solvent inks, which is your archival ink and your stays on inks. So, as I said, oh, and going old school, there's also VersaMagic, which is a multi-surface chalk ink, which just kind of gives you a matte chalky look. And according to the back of this, it is archival, which means it would be permanent. So it would fall more in the category of your pigment and your solvent inks than your distress and your dye inks. So that is the important distinction between your inks. Dye-based inks are not permanent. If you get water on a project you stamped with your dye-based ink, the ink is going to run. And that's why I did my little sampler here. And this is on a piece of Artist Loft mixed media paper. So I stamped this going on like 4 hours ago. So I let it dry. And I probably should have stamped the Positively Saturated just to see, but I forgot. So this is a Tim Holtz stamp, and you can also kind of see the difference in how the inks stamp. So this, I used a rubber stamp, so one of these guys. This is Distress Oxide, and I would have done them all in black, but I don't have the Distress Oxide black. I only have the Distress Oxide. Like, I went with one of the dark ones, so I used Scorched Timber. My Distress ink in Black Soot. My Memento in Tuxedo Black. My VersaFine in Onyx Black. my VersaFine Claire in Nocturne, my Archival, and that's in Black Soot, and then the StazOn is in Jet Black. So, what should happen is we will see movement in the Memento, the Distress Oxide, and the Distress Ink, because they are all dye-based. Oxide is a combination of dye and pigment. And you can see, like, these two stamp the best. These guys, these two probably stamp the worst. My Archival probably just needs re-inking. And then the StazOn also probably could use a re-inking, but they're pretty good in crispness of the stamping. And your Distress Oxide does pretty good because it's got that pigment ink in it. So first we're gonna spritz them with a little water. And I'm gonna come in with the towel and go like this. And you notice, especially with the Distress ink, it's very smudgy. None of these guys, the ink did not move for any of these, right? So these are our permanent inks. These three are not. Now I'm gonna come in with a water brush and see if we can get even more movement. And I suspect we're gonna see more movement in the Distress because they're formulated to be highly water reactive. See, look at that. We're moving. And the other thing with the oxide is it will oxidize, so you'll get a chalky effect when you add water to it. But as you see, lots of movement of that ink. It's gonna have less movement with the Memento. So it's moving a little bit. It's not moving as much as the Distress inks, but we are getting a little blurring of it, a little bit of movement of the color. Our VersaFine, not budging at all. Our VersaFine, not budging at all. StazOn, no movement. Archival, no movement. Kind of want to just stamp real quick. Let's grab just a random small stamp. And we'll just set it aside and let it dry on its own and come back. But I have a feeling it might be a dye-based ink or a hybrid. And then we'll do one of the chalk inks, which I don't have a ton of them, and they're really old, so they're not holding up great anymore. Because I don't know if you could see the imprint of the last stamp I used on the pad. So yeah, they're a little bit older and a little less happy. But see, you can see how it's kind of like a more matte, chalky finish than these guys. All right, we'll set those aside. Because so the first thing to keep in mind is if you want to, say, stamp an image in and color it with watercolors, you're going to want to go with one of these guys, not one of those. Because, see, it's going to end up messing up your image because it's going to bleed. If you're doing watercolor stamping, you're going to want to make sure you're using one of these guys because you want it to move. And what do I mean by watercolor stamping? I will do a quick demonstration. Put out our mat. And I'm not going to be too worried about how perfect of a stamped image I get. But let's say, well, we'll demo both watercolor stamping and coloring with watercolors. So if I wanted to color something with watercolors, I'd come in. My ink of choice is going to be one of the VersaFines because I think they stamp the best of the inks. This is the go-to if you realize you forgot to stamp a sentiment on the card and you don't have Misty and you don't want to have to worry about it not stamping perfectly. That's the ink you go with because that stamps beautifully. One off, pretty much every time. Now, if you want to do watercolor stamping, so that's I'm going to color this with some kind of watercolor. Let's dry that and we'll do that real quick. And you can watercolor with just about anything you want. For example, you can use actual watercolor paints. You can use distress watercolor pencils. You can use distress inks. So I can go on to a block with some distress ink, and that's Pitch Flamingo. Take the water brush, lift it up, and color my image. And you notice my lines are not smudging, because as soon as this is dry, it's permanent. If I had gone in while it was wet, I might be able to get it to move some. So you want to wait until it dries, but voila. Now, watercolor stamping would be a technique where you ink up your stamp. So since I've got the mushrooms out, spritz your stamp with water. That was probably too much water, but, and then stamp. Oh yeah, that was way too much water. Got a little heavy-handed there. This would be a good one to do in the Misty so that you could stamp back over to pull back in some of the details. Let me grab, I've got a better stamp for this. The Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous Winter Watercolors 2 CMS 443 is kind of designed for doing this kind of stamping. So you're not going for super detailed. You're just inking it up. This time we're going to go a little less heavy-handed with the spraying. I'm just turning away so I'm not spraying my paper. And I just lightly misted. So there's a little bit of water on there. And so it gets you a watercolor effect versus if I stamped it with, say, the VersaFine Claire Nocturne. That's more solid. This is a softer watercolory effect. You can go in and add even more water to get it to move a little bit more. Like I said, with this guy, you could theoretically try, let's see, if I did this in my Misty, to stamp it again. See, I'd have better luck doing this with a clear stamp to try and line it up. Yeah, that was not lined up exactly right, but you could go back in and stamp again to get in some more detail. But the idea is you're getting like a looser effect with your stamping. So if you want to do a watercolor effect with your stamping, you're going to want to use a dye-based ink. Ideally, I'd say distress ink. I think it's the most reactive, water reactive of the dye-based inks, because it's designed more for wet techniques and other kind of distressing techniques and things like that than for stamping. Because I think by far my least favorite thing to stamp with, especially with a clear stamp, is distress ink. Like, clear stamps do not like being stamped with distress ink at all. I can show you what I mean. And let's go with a darker color so it'll show up a little bit better. Let's grab some Villainous Potion. And I will grab 2 clear stamps. We will grab this bunny outline and the fill-in bunny peep stamp by, these are Simon Says stamps that I got forever ago. Okay, but not a full solid image. Again, not a complete full solid image. Now let's go and do Memento, and I actually have some colors. Let's do that in a color. Memento Elderberry tends to beat up more on clear stamps when you're using a dye-based ink. So there we go. Again, still not full coverage. That's a little bit better. So Memento, I think, stamps a little bit better in your dye-based inks than your distress ink. Let's pull out, I've got Villainous Potion Oxide ink. So, not great. That's Villainous Potion. I've also got a Versifying Clair in a purple. I've got Versifying Clair in Monarch. I don't think I have a regular Versifying. Now look at the difference in like the coverage when I ink that. And solid stamps are always a little bit more difficult to get a good impression with. But look at that. That's almost perfect. And that is perfect. Like that is why I like my Versifyings for stamping. Stays on in Gothic Purple. Just wiping off the stamps. And these are fairly new, so it's going to be a bit juicier than my black. So it's okay. It's not great. Now this is where having a Misty would be helpful, because I could go back in and repeat stamp where I'd stamped before. So that was pretty good. Now another thing to keep in mind with your clear stamps, and if this is something that's going to bother you, StazOn will stain unless you get out like a stamp cleaning solution. And then finally, I've got an archival in Villainous Potion. I bought, when they came out with like the mini sets of archival in the Distress Ink color palette, the set, because I was like, oh, it would be nice to have a permanent ink that matches the Distress Ink colors. I honestly don't love how it stamps. So yeah, it does not stamp great, especially with the clear stamps. So looking at that, your Versifying Clair is your best option stamping wise. Just straight up stamping Versifying Clair. Now, you're probably wondering, why do I have all these other inks then? For some very good reasons. If you are planning on coloring with Copic markers, you cannot use your Versifying or your Versifying Clair. What will end up happening is you will ruin the nib on your marker, because the alcohol solvent in the marker, in your alcohol ink marker, will lift the ink, the pigment ink. So if you use alcohol ink markers with a pigment ink and touch your marker to any of the pigment ink, you're going to end up sucking that ink onto the tip of your marker and ruining the marker tip. Not a huge deal with Copic markers, other than that it's a pain in the neck and you're going to have to change the nib. I don't know, like, I only have Copic markers because I am not buying a gazillion different types of alcohol markers, and because I can refill the Copic markers and I can replace the nibs. That's why I picked them back when I first started coloring with them, and why I'm sticking with them now. So that is why I have the Memento ink, which I bought. And you also shouldn't use it with your archival or your StazOn either, because the same thing I think will happen. You want a dye-based ink. That is the only ink you're going to want to use if you're coloring with alcohol ink markers, because you're not going to ruin your marker if you do that. And so that's why I have the Memento ink, is so that I can color with Copic markers. And I wouldn't use the Distress Oxide either, because that's got pigment in it as well. So you can't use any of those. You can only use Distress or like Memento or any other straight up dye-based ink if you're going to be coloring with Copic markers. And there are plenty of other inks out there. These are just the ones I have, and so that's why I go with the Memento, because I think it stamps better than the Distress ink. Now, as I said, I bought the archival inks so that I could have ink colors that match my Distress inks for when I wanted to do stamping and wet inky techniques, so I could have them match each other. That's the only reason I ended up getting the archival. I don't know that I would buy them again, because my StazOn does what I want to do when I want to stamp on non-porous surfaces. So I don't know that I need the archival. I have it, I use it occasionally, but it is not a go-to for me. The Distress Oxide and the Distress inks, I don't tend to use for stamping, except maybe when I'm doing like stamped bits and bobs because it has a color I want and I'm using the red rubber so it'll stamp pretty good. These I mostly use for doing wet inky background techniques, watercoloring with, grunging things. Like, these are not part of my, what I consider my stamping ink collection. Those are primarily my Memento, my VersaFine and VersaFine Clair, and then my StazOn, because dye-based inks, and I also think the pigment inks, don't work well with non-porous surfaces. So if you are wanting to stamp on things like vellum or acetate, you're gonna need either a StazOn or an archival. I don't think the pigments work very well, but it may be that I'm just not patient enough. So here's a piece of acetate. Let's use the mushrooms because the red rubber just stamps better. And we will do the laughable and stamp with distress ink, just for illustrative purposes. So I've inked it up, all set. I'm gonna stamp on my acetate. And that's something to keep in mind also about your, here, let's use this as backing, is the distress inks are translucent. Your pigment inks are opaque. Villainous Potion Distress Oxide, to kind of illustrate the difference between. So you can see the difference, and look at how smooshy it is. So we'll go through and stamp all three of all types of our ink on the acetate so you can see what happens. All right, so StazOn is my favorite for stamping on acetate. I think it works the best. A couple things to keep in mind when stamping on acetate. It's very slippery, so it's very easy to like move your stamp around and cause it to get smudgy. So it's pretty much press down, lift up. And I probably should be doing, as we're going, a piece of vellum to show you that as well. Let's start back with our distress. Archival. And our VersaFine. Now, I don't know how well you can tell, but they are staying very wet. Some of these. So, I'm going to come over here to this guy, and I'm going to use a clean paper towel. Completely dry paper towel. We stamped that first. Is never going to dry on there. The same with the oxide. Never going to dry. Now, don't stamp on vellum all that often, but I suspect not going to be dry. Oh, interesting. You can, the dye-based ink does work. My guess is because this is semi-porous. The oxide is going to be smooshier, yep, because it's semi-porous. So some of the dye has sunk into the vellum. So probably if we left that sit longer, it would have not smudged. Now, I'm looking at this. It looks like it might still be a little wet, but we're gonna try, because the StazOn will be permanent on the acetate once you let it dry completely. See, it's smudged a little bit, mostly because it's not fully dry. The archival should be as well, but I find it takes a heck of a lot longer to dry than the StazOn, and if you're impatient, you're going to end up getting it smudged like that. StazOn is not smudging at all on the vellum. Archival smudges a little bit. And this is what I've also found with the archival. When I'm using it on either non-porous or semi-porous papers, you got to leave it sit for a really long time, and even then it tends to be a little smudgy. Now, The pigment ink on this is just gonna wipe off. And on here, I suspect we're gonna get smudging because it's, ooh, yeah. Real bad smudging. Now let's pull out our heat tool and see what happens if we dry. Drying it's causing it to smudge together. Yeah. So when I'm stamping on acetate or something like vellum, which is semi-porous, I also pulled over some parchment paper because I have not experimented with stamping on this. I suspect our results are going to be similar to the vellum. My preferred ink is Stays On. You just need to leave it sit to dry completely and you're good to go. So let's stamp this real quick and see what happens with our various stamps. Wow, you can barely see that on there. Wow, it's not taking the ink very well. That's stamped pretty darn good. That's stamped pretty good. All right, I'm gonna clean this off so that they can have a moment to fully dry, and we'll try wiping them off. Let's see what happens. We'll take a clean paper towel. It's coming off a little bit. As I said, it's so hard to see the distress ink on there. It's kind of hard to tell. Pigment, definitely coming off. Again, it's so light, it's kind of hard to tell. Stays On should be fine. Stays On is perfect. Maybe a little smudgy where it's still a little wet. Archival, we're getting the smudginess. And let's face it, this is just going to blur. I'm like, I know what this pigment's going to do. It's just going to get all kinds of blurry. So, what inks you need depends on what you're planning on stamping on and what you're planning on doing when you stamp. Your distress inks, not permanent. Designed to react with water extensively. So, I don't consider these go-to for stamping inks. Occasionally, like if I'm going to do watercolor stamping, where what I want is for it to get loose and watery, and where did it go? Get this kind of effect, distress inks, best option. Either an ink or an oxide. It's going to give you the most movement, the most flow. It's going to work great for that kind of technique. If I want a precise, crisp stamp, definitely not distress ink. Oxide does a little bit better, but not as well as your VersaFines. If I am stamping it and I'm not going to be using any kind of alcohol-based marker with it, VersaFine Clair or just regular VersaFine, those are the go-to stamping inks. They stamp the best. They are the best for stamping. All right. And once they are dry, they are permanent. You can do whatever kind of watery techniques you want with them. They're not going to move. Now, if I'm stamping, archival theoretically is supposed to work well on non-porous surfaces. I find it takes too long to dry. I prefer Stays On for acetate, vellum, anything that isn't like just straight paper. My go-to Stays On. It works the best. Now since we've been sitting for a while and let our two dry, let's see what happens when we add water to them. So the first test we did was we just spritzed them with water, and yeah, that's reacting. So that is at the very least a hybrid, if not a dye-based ink. So that did not move. That did. Now our water brush test. Yeah, that is probably a dye-based ink. Possibly may have some pigment in it. Possibly is a hybrid. But the chalk ink, not moving. So again, your dye-based inks are gonna, and it's a highly water-reactive dye-based ink, because the Memento, it's a dye-based ink. It's gonna react when you add water to it, but not as extreme as the distressed ink or the Simon Says Stamp positively saturated inks. They are highly water reactive, as is distress oxide. Memento is just water reactive. So if you're going to watercolor your image, bear in mind if you use a Memento ink, it's gonna bleed a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. So that might affect your final product, because it is gonna bleed when you add water to it. If you're doing any kind of alcohol ink coloring of your stamped images, you need to use a dye-based ink. You can use the positively saturated, which and it may be in part because they're new and so they're really juicy. I think they stamp a little bit better than the distress ink. Or your Memento, that's a dye-based ink. That's my go-to for stamping. I've got it in black, I've got it in brown, and then I bought a variety of the dewdrops to go with some of those layering stamps years ago, before I fully understood the difference between dye and pigment inks, because they don't work great, as we did with our bunny. So that was distress ink, distress oxide, Memento. It doesn't get us full coverage. I'm better off using a VersaFine for doing layering stamps. So I have a bunch of these. I may eventually decide to part with them, but they have space. I have space for them, so I don't absolutely have to. I may decide I no longer need them and want to go with more of the Simon Says Stamp, because I do really like the colors they have, which is why I bought like a 4-pack of the little mini cubes, because I was like, ooh, I like the colors, because I got Dew and Raindrop and Cabbage and Kale and Mist and Artichoke. So I like these colors. So I may end up switching out for them instead of keeping my Mementos. Don't know, but they are definitely a dye, possibly a hybrid. Not 100% sure on that, but definitely highly water reactive. And just from my opinion viewpoint, I don't love archival. I just don't love it. It is permanent once it's dry, but I just don't find that it stamps great. And I don't know if that's because it's the distress line of colors, so the idea is for them to be a little bit more distressed in how they stamp, but I do not love the archival. Actually, let's check. I've got one non-archival distress ink. No, non-distress archival ink. I got Pebble Beach, and that one stamps a little bit better, I think. See, but even then, it did not stamp as good as my pigment ink. Let's try wiping the stamp off again and just doing one more attempt with that. Yeah, so quite honestly, I picked this up because I kept seeing somebody using it and I was like, oh, I like the color and how it's being. So I got it and I'll use it. But honestly, not sure that I'd buy any more archival inks. I prefer, for something that needs to be permanent, my VersaFines, and for something that needs to go on a non-porous surface, StazOn. So that's Stamps and Ink Selection 101. If you've got any questions, please feel free to leave them down in the description box below. I hope this was helpful and gave you all the important information you needed to know about stamps and the types of stamps and the pros and cons of the different types of stamps and the inks, because I think stamp and ink selection is probably the #1 thing that's going to impact the results you get when you are stamping. The other thing that's going to impact it is if you're using a smooth or a textured cardstock. Like this is a smooth cardstock. This is smooth. If you're stamping on like watercolor paper, be prepared because it has a texture for your images not to be as crisp. You're never going to get really great crisp stamped images if you're stamping on a textured paper. So just keep that in mind when you're stamping. One more thing about the Memento, if you're planning on coloring with alcohol ink markers, I highly recommend a Misty, because I can't tell you the number of times before I got my Misty where I'd stamp, and especially if you're using clear stamps, the number of times I ended up tossing images out because I didn't like how they stamped with the Memento, because it does not stamp as well, especially on a clear stamp, as a VersaFine or VersaFine Clair. Having the Misty allows me to re-stamp it so I can get that fuller, cleaner image. So I do highly recommend. It is an investment, but if you're going to be doing a lot of alcohol ink marker coloring of your stamped images, Misty or the all-new Stamp Wheel, or I think, is it Sizzix or Spellbinders has some kind of stamping platform out now too. Having a stamping platform so you can re-stamp the image in the exact same spot till you get a full and complete image, game changer when you're stamping with a dye-based ink. So it's one of those, save your pennies for it, because it's going to make you so much happier when you're stamping, and you're going to have a lot less frustration of, oh, I've stamped this image and I've got to stamp it 6 times to get one good image for me to color. Highly recommend some kind of stamping platform for that. So that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, please do all the things that lets YouTube know you enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave me a comment down below. Thanks for joining me, and happy crafting.